government don't realize the impact that your courthouse has. If you talk to your economic development leaders, people recognize whether your courthouse is well maintained before people, businesses, manufacturers, people that your economic development people would like to bring into your community. So you need to know the value of your courthouse. It's hard to put a dollar on for me. We'll see what Donovan has to say. Is that a fair statement, Donovan?
You bet it is.
I'm going to let you take it from here.
Well, I'm so pleased to be with you because it's kind of like you get to the sand hills of Nebraska.
You're almost in Rapid City where I grew up. And so it's like almost like coming home. I certainly wish I could be with you in person, but we'll make do as we make do. But thank you so much for having me. So if I were there in person, at least one of you would ask me this question. So how'd you end up here? How'd you end up some guy that talks about economics and historic preservation? And I'll give you I want to start giving you the answer that I usually give to people, and it's this. I grew up in Rapid City, wonderful town to grow up in, and a couple of years after college moved back there, and was in business by myself as a small scale developer and real estate appraiser with offices in downtown Rapid City. But as part of my practice, I did continuing ed courses for real estate brokers and salesmen. And as part of that, I tried to keep up with the changes in federal tax law as they affected real estate. So I'm talking about that. And in 1976, along comes a tax credit, the first tax credit for restoring historic buildings. And so I just passed it on to these brokers. Hey, I don't know what historic buildings are exactly, but we must have some here in Rapid City. And some of you guys ought to take advantage of this, all of whom were making more money than I was. And then it came along this building. It's called the Buell Building, built in 1888 and 89, about statehood time for South Dakota. And I got out of the blue a call from the State Historic Preservation Office in South Dakota saying, hey, we've got some grant money, and there is a building in Rapid City that we'd like. And if we give you some grant money over a fiscal year or two, would you buy the building and restore it? So I said, well, yeah, I'll do that. But I don't have any money, but if I can borrow the money and you can give me some money, that's what I'll do. And so between 1979 and 1981, I rehabilitated this building. And during the construction period, I get a call from somebody who says, I'm whoever it was from the Historic South Dakota Foundation, and we're a new statewide nonprofit, and we're going to have our meeting in Rapid City. And while we're there, would you give us a tour of your building? And I said, happy to do that. And so for the first time in my life, I met these people who called themselves preservationists, all of whom talked about real estate, none of whom knew anything about real estate. So I thought about that for a year or two and said, I don't want to kind of be in the reverse situation of actually doing this preservation stuff, not really knowing anything about it. So I took a mid-career break and went to Columbia to get a master's degree in historic preservation. And while we had traveled in large cities before, I'd never lived in one. And I just realized I want to live in big cities. And so kind of midway through that experience at Columbia, I made connections with the National Trust in Washington, signed them on as a client, and ultimately my family and I moved to Washington, where my practice has been in the kind of talking. Lots of times I see myself as the translator between the world of historic preservation and of real estate and economics. So that's how I usually, and so for the last almost 40 years, we've lived in Washington, and that's been my practice. And that's how I've told this story for a long time. And it's true, and it's not untrue, but the more I've thought about it, particularly in recent years, the more I realize that it didn't start with the Buell building. It started with this building, which is the county courthouse in Butte County, South Dakota, Belfouche, about 60 miles northwest of Rapid City. And when I was growing up in Rapid City, my grandfather was the county highway superintendent in Butte County. And his office was in the basement of this building. And when I suppose 10 or 11, I started spending considerable parts of my summers with my grandparents in Belfouche, and often would go with my grandfather to work. And what I realized as a little kid, first of all, going up the front steps was like a big deal. We always went in the back door and down the steps to the basement to his office. And it wasn't that there was any sign that said you can't walk up at the front steps, but somehow I just got this intuitive sense that that was really something special. And then if my grandpa was on the phone or doing something else, I might, go out and then walk up the stairs from the basement up to the area under the rotunda. You have courthouses very similar. And it just felt like something was really important there. I didn't know what, I couldn't articulate, but it just felt like it was important. Clearly, this was the most beautiful building in the town. So it kind of felt like a privilege always to get to be there. And then on the days that the county commissioners were meeting, I just knew that there was important things happening. So some dumb kid shouldn't be going up and up to the upper stairs. I better stay in the basement because that was really important things that were happening. So it really was this courthouse that put me on a path that ended up where I am today. Well, and where I am, like today, I get introduced as an economist. And so probably Dr. Kent, from whom I took state and local taxation at the University of South Dakota, from whom I got a D, would probably roll over as a grade that I got referred to as an economist, but I bluffed my way through. So some of this might seem like the eternal economics seminar, and if so, I apologize in advance. But in real estate economics, there is this concept called the forces of value, the stuff out there in the marketplace, the stuff that pushes the value of any individual property up or down. Now, think about your community. Lots of you have towns or cities that have more than one elementary school. And I'll bet in many cases, there's a sense in the community that, oh, that Lincoln Elementary, that's a little better than the Jefferson Elementary. Now, it may not even be true, doesn't matter. That if what happens to the identical house that is in those two different school districts, well, the one in the school district that's deemed better will pay for a premium. No difference in the four walls and the roof. They're identical, but the value, the economic value of that house is different because of this social force of value. Just what people have in their heads will change the value of real estate, social force of value. The second is the economic force of value. Now, today, if you wanted to buy a house and get a 30-year fixed rate mortgage, you could probably get a mortgage for 3.5 or 4%. What if tomorrow the Federal Reserve Bank raised the discount rate and then banks raised their mortgage rates, and all of a sudden tomorrow to borrow money to buy a house, you had to pay 8.5% instead of 3.5%. The value of your house in the sand hills of Nebraska is going to go down. House didn't change from yesterday to today, but the economic context within which that house exists changed, and so the value of the house will change. The third is the political force of value. And this isn't political about Republicans and Democrats or even necessarily about elected officials. It's more about the more basic meaning of political, and that is a group of people acting together for some common end. So think about your community, and there's a parcel of land right at the edge of town that's zoned agriculture. And tomorrow, the county zoning commission meets and rezones it light industrial. Well, what happens? Well, overnight, the value of that land changed, probably went up. The land did not change. The land is identical. but what you could do with that land changed its value, and that's the political force of value. And then the physical force of value. Think about two houses sitting side by side, built by the same builder in the same year. One is in great physical condition, the other is falling down. Which will sell for more? Well, the one in great physical condition. But that's the only one of these four forces of value that have anything to do with the physical condition of the walls and the roof. All of the rest of those things are outside that physical. And so the lesson here is that the economic value of real estate is driven by a whole bunch of things, factors, in fact, are not economic factors, but all of those are components of what make up economic value. Now, think about your courthouses and their values and their forces of value in that regard. There is a social value in the courthouse. For people like this, there's some annual event on the courthouse lawn. I remember as a kid in Rapid City, when the big summer parade was coming about, the band would meet behind the courthouse to assemble for the parade. Those are all social forces of value that give you a warm feeling about that place. And again, social value isn't in the abstract. It has a social force of value has an effect on what value is. Then there's the economic force of value. And again, courthouse, as you know better than I, plays a big role. Sometimes it casts a shadow on the business district it sits. The sales at that cafe downtown will go up on jury days. The purchases of goods and services by the county affects the business district. So lots of ways, and you collect the taxes. So there's lots of this economic force of value at play from that courthouse. Then, of course, there's the political force of value. You have a building that houses all three units of government. The legislative and the judicial and the executive are all housed in that courthouse in most cases. It's where we count the ballots. It's where we go to register to vote. All kinds of political things are tied up in that structure. And then, of course, there's the physical force of value. In many of your communities, in most of them, I would suggest. In fact, that county courthouse is one of the most important, iconic, and in many cases, beautiful buildings in the town or city. Now, this is probably a point where it's lucky that I'm talking to you remotely instead of in person, because some of you might throw tomatoes at the stage. But I have to say that politically, I'm somebody who believes that elected officials have a responsibility to be frugal with taxpayers' dollars. I don't think that taxes should be wasted. So I'm unequivocal about that. But I got to say, it irks me when there are elected officials who say, oh, taxes are already too high. We can't spend that much. We can't do that. That's a waste of taxpayers' money. We can't go for this extra stuff. Well, think about the citizens of Butte County in 1911 when that courthouse was built. Do you think that you have less money today in your county than they had in Butte County 100 years ago? Of course not. Of course not. And yet, those people made this commitment, not just to build a building, but to building that was going to last. It was going to serve the citizens for generations. They knew when they voted at the county commission to fund that new courthouse that they would be dead before that courthouse was out of its utility for the county. And yet they did it. Today, too many places we think like we're striving for government by Kmart. And we argue, we try to defend that, saying, oh, I'm being frugal with the taxpayers' money, I'm being conservative. No, you're not. You're being wasteful, because what you're really doing is saying, yeah, I just want to pay for my deal, my kid and my grandkid and this kid, they're going to have to pay for their own. So instead of building a building like the one we're looking at here that served 3 or 4 or 5 generations, we build crappy buildings that last a generation, and then somebody has to replace them. That is not conservative. That's irresponsibility of the taxpayers' money. So that's my little rant out for the day. So anyway, the value from the courthouse, force of value, is also in its physical condition. But again, most of your courthouses are historic. And in the world of historic preservation, there's also a whole set of non-economic values. There's cultural value, there's aesthetic value, there's associative value, the fact that buildings are attached to some human being or some event that took place there. Symbolic values, educational values, environmental values, the stuff that doesn't go to the landfill because we keep it in place. And I would suggest to you that your courthouses also hold, in most cases, all of those values. The cultural value about the evolution of your community, the aesthetic value of the beauty of that courthouse, the associative value that the first county commissioners were elected there. Maybe a governor served as the county treasurer there. Symbolic values, and this is what's really important. Again, those people who built your courthouse, it wasn't just a building. They could have built, 30,000 square feet and held all the functions. It's that there was the symbolism that that building, the building itself, said justice is important, that freedom is important, that democracy is important, that those American values were incorporated into the physical fabric of that building. So a huge symbolic value. And then educational value, both directly and indirectly. The kids that come marching through and looking at the paintings on the wall, but the educational value that's found in the Register of Deeds and the archives and the marriage licenses and the court records, the educational value of that. And then again, this issue about environmental value that's becoming more and more important. That when we throw away buildings, in fact, we are throwing away the energy that's embodied into those buildings. And we can't say that we're being environmentally responsible if we say we don't have to figure out how to keep as many of the standing buildings that we got already. So not only does your courthouse have these forces of value from the real estate economics, but in fact, they have these preservation values as well. Well, I was asked to talk about some of these impacts. And so I'm going to talk about 4 programs that where people are paying attention to courthouse. The first is the Texas Historical Commission. It's had a great program for 22 or 23 years restoring courthouses. That's one I talk first is because I've known about the program from its beginning, and it happened when Laura Bush was the first lady of Texas. She loved historic preservation and she loved the county courthouses of Texas, and so she was really the big proponent of that. But again, I have I've never worked on it, never done any studies on it. I'll just tell you what I've learned about its impact. The second that I'll talk about is the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program. A couple of years ago, we did a statewide study of the impacts of historic preservation in Arkansas. As part of that analysis, we looked at a variety of the grant programs, one of which is a courthouse grant program. So I'll give you a little number or two about that. And then the third one is the Landmarks Illinois program. Now I know that, and many of you were probably there, that Bonnie was here a couple of years ago talking about their courthouse initiative. And so you might hear some of the stuff from me about that you heard from her before. But I save that one for last because that we were hired. Bonnie was our client, and we were hired to do the analysis of the impact of this courthouse grant program that they had at Landmarks Illinois. So those are the 3 I'm going to talk to you about. So first is the Texas Historical Courthouse Preservation Program. This happens to be the Fort Worth, the courthouse in Fort Worth. And just to let you know that sometimes it does have blizzards in Fort Worth, Texas. But they've done a good job of tracking a wonderful program. Been around since 1999. They've done a good job of tracking what that's meant. Well, over 11,800 jobs for Texans have been created. And by the way, and you'll hear me talk about it later, what a job means is one full-time equivalent job for 1 year. So 2 plumbers working for 6 months each is one full-time job. 1 plumber working for 2 years is 2 jobs. So when you hear that word jobs, it means 1 full-time equivalent job for 1 year. And those jobs have generated for Texans $690 million in income. That this Texas program has generated 850 million increase in the gross state product in the Texas economy, and importantly to all of you who either are making decisions about how counties get their money, or sometimes some of you are paid by the county money. 44 million in state and local taxes generated through this program. And then they have been pretty systematic in Texas about saying what are the benefits of having done that. Well, and some of you I know are responsible for the maintenance of your courthouses. Maintenance then becomes more manageable after this reinvestment, significant savings on utility costs, safer environment for county employees and residents, increased energy efficiency, compliance with accessibility requirements, increased user safety and limit damage in the event of fire, safe and secure storage for county records, more efficient space for the use of the records by the public, reduced energy use, filtration through windows particularly, compliance with life safety code requirements, increased employment in the construction industry, and particularly important to somebody like me who works narrowly in this field of preservation, strengthened skills of craftspeople in many of those specialty trades. These are things of value. These are values to your local community because you've reinvested in your courthouse. Well, then the Arkansas Courthouse Restoration Grant Program. Again, this was just a small piece of a much larger study that we did in Arkansas. And by the way, later on when I close, I'll give you the website for PlaceEconomics, our U.S. firm. Virtually all of our clients allow us to post the studies on our website. So you can go into the tab marked resources on the PlaceEconomics website and download these studies that I reference. So this was the Arkansas statewide preservation impact study. And they have, as part of that, this county courthouse restoration grant program. It's been around since 1988. $26 million had been awarded. That was 540 individual grants in 64 counties, widely dispersed around the state. Annually, their budget goes from someplace between $150,000 to $1 million, depending on their revenues. Arkansas has an interesting way of funding their state historic preservation office, in that instead of having to go to the legislature every year or every 2 years and get their budget allocation, they get a fixed share of the real estate transfer tax in Arkansas. So they have a kind of reliable, steady stream of income. It goes up and down when there's good or bad real estate markets, but at least there you don't have to fight with legislators every time to get an appropriation. They do an interesting thing in Arkansas, in that in exchange for receiving the grant, they take a facade easement, a preservation easement that then becomes part of the chain of title and requires then future, for those in the future who are responsible for that building, to in fact maintain that exterior, particularly the exterior of the building. And this is the Courthouse Restoration Grant Program is the largest of the preservation agencies. So over that kind of 30 years or so, you can see they had grants in 4 large categories: the certified local government grants, the courthouse grants, downtown revitalization, and historic restoration. Well, the courthouse grants were the biggest over that time period, both in the number of the grants, but also in the amount that was awarded. And again, the average grants of that program was 11,000 for the CLG grants and 7,500 for downtown revitalization, about 25,000 for the historic restoration, and then over 51 million or 51,000 average per grant for the courthouse grant program. So a wonderful, wonderful program. It's really appreciated by judges and county commissioners and just citizens all over the state. And then the study that we did do, the Landmarks Illinois, it was their Richard Driehaus Courthouse Initiative. He was died earlier this year, but was a big philanthropist, investment banker, made a lot of money, but gave most of it away. And he loved historic preservation and architecture. And so he funded this courthouse initiative because he understood how important throughout Illinois, but particularly rural Illinois, the important role those courthouses played in the community. So gave a $1 million gift that funded basically a 5-year program. Over that time, 18 projects were funded. And what we did when we looked at the studies, we said, all right, here's the grants that were given. And as you'll see, many of them were not very large. But then what was the match? The typical minimum was 50-50, but sometimes there's a little deviation from that, and sometimes a lot more raised by the community. Then that generated some indirect activity as well, so that in the end, that $1 million gift that ended up in 700,000 grants actually was a cause for $4.5 million worth of economic activity. And then the other thing we looked at because we visited all 18 of these communities where these grants were made, we asked about what happened as a result of this. Well, what we discovered was that there was millions of dollars of planned activity in the future, both by the county in making improvements to the courthouse, but additional investments and then private and public sector investments in addition, spurred by this correct maintenance and rehabilitation of these courthouses. So I just want to give you some examples of some of the towns, what happened. So this was in Brown County. They got the total amount of the project was $60,000. That was about half and half between the Landmarks Illinois grant and what they raised locally. And again, different communities raised things locally. Sometimes the county appropriated the other part. Sometimes they had fundraisers. Sometimes they found another grant from someplace else, put it together. And I'll have to tell you one thing about this assignment from our perspective. As a research firm, we started out thinking we're going to establish a set of 3 or 4 or 5 metrics to look at these impacts and then apply them consistently to every town that we looked at. Well, what we learned is that it didn't work. In fact, the kinds of impacts varied immensely from one place to another, kind of what happened subsequent to that grant. So they did this, improved this exterior lighting. In the next year or two, 44,000 in facade grants were given to local buildings around the courthouse, 330,000 in street trees, $1.2 million in building rehabilitations in that immediate downtown area, $3.5 million in new construction, and one of these kind of social forces of value, it revived the town's fall festival that was always held in front of the courthouse. Near Coles County, a $40,000 project to fix the clock tower, and fixing the clock tower is a kind of popular use for these grant funds. Well, what happened is that they got so committed to this clock tower repair that the commissioner said, you know, we can't let this building decline. So they came up with 340,000 in courthouse pointing, 800,000 in courthouse window replacements that have been planned. And then it catalyzed saying, we need to know about the condition of our buildings. So they did a full architectural and engineering review to know what they were going to have to do in coming years to keep their courthouse. Cumberland County, again, a clock face repair, $12,000, half from the grant. It catalyzed 20,000 in benches and repairs on the courthouse lawn, and revived a spring festival on the courthouse lawn. But here was my favorite part about this one, is when they were about to lift the thing in place, the clock tower back in place, all the school kids got out of school to go down and watch that happening. Well, I guarantee you that these kids that you see in this picture, they're going to take their grandchildren to that courthouse and say, see that clock tower? I was there when they put it back up. That is value in your community. Edgar County, here's one that they had a very large project because they got a small grant, and then they said, we got to be serious about this building. So in this case, a relatively small grant from the Landmarks Illinois. They received this. Edgar County got grants from elsewhere, including restoration of the Statue of Liberty that was on the building. So their project was $1.1 million. As a result, 10 new businesses in the courthouse area, 95,000 in streetscape improvements. And then they got a book. Some local author then said, this is a big deal, and wrote the book about the history of the courthouse and Lady Justice, the statue they got restored. Effingham County, $16,000, 8 new businesses, 300,000 in facade grants, 6 new upper floor housing units, 290,000 in streetscapes, and 800 or 787,000 of volunteer hours that they quantified. This is not a rich county; it doesn't have much, and so they got people to do stuff, and that is the roots. And that's again, it's a value of your courthouse that somebody's willing to give up their time to. In this case, they kind of restored the kind of dance hall, open meeting space on the second floor of the courthouse. In Fayette County, again, exterior lighting and window repair, reduced maintenance costs. This initial effort said that it made them plan for another 105,000 in window restorations, and they raised $2,000 for special events. A major expenditure in Henry County, because of kind of its significance as a courthouse, got more money than most of them. And here, the 87% of the money came from the Landmarks Illinois. Only 13% raised locally. They did exterior lighting and again clock repair, but they saw this huge addition adding exterior lighting. But because the nature of the work that they in fact, there was no change in the utilities. The residents feel safer. You can't tell me that there's not a real economic value in residents feeling safer. Lawrence County, about a 50-50 project. Building rehabilitation, they received other grant monies, new downtown businesses. Macoupin County, a larger project, 208,000. And they again were taking the long view. And so they spent a lot of the money on engineering analysis to see what they were going to have to do so they could schedule the appropriate maintenance and care of that building over time. They allowed them to do fundraising for courthouse repairs, and the stairs, the wonderful stairs that had been closed to the public for years, were opened up again. Sangamon County, 20,000 from the foundation. Spent $40,000 restoring doors. Well, the result, wonderful historic doors, but it, deteriorated over the years. Well, the fact was the utility bills. They're starting to get a return immediately when those doors were repaired in increased events. But here's a kind of conclusion that we had after doing this study, that in virtually every instance, there was a renewed understanding of the importance of the historic courthouse to the community and an enhanced appreciation, not just of the courthouse, but of other historic buildings in the county. Local businesses benefited through restored storefronts, increased revenues during evening events, and while the infrastructure and facade improvements were taking place, job creation, additional tourism dollars, improved infrastructure, including the sidewalk, increased media attention. The communities benefited through revived or additional festivals, beautification and infrastructure around their central business district, the student field trips and in-depth history lessons that courthouse allowed, pride in their business districts, local history repositories and museums, and potential increase in property values. And then the county benefited through increased economic activity, tax revenues, increase in property values, and they ended up with a safer, healthier, and more beautiful courthouse buildings. I'm a quantification guy, so I decided for this presentation to say, what's the magic number? And the magic number is this, $182,482. That's the magic number, because when you spend $182,000 in change, that creates one full-time direct job. And again, that might be two half-year jobs or 4 quarter, 3-month jobs, whatever, one full-time direct job, and then indirect and induced jobs. And that's kind of geeky economics talk, so I want to define them. Think about somebody working on the assembly line in Detroit making an automobile. Person making the car is a direct job in the automobile industry. But in order to make that car, they've got to buy steel. So that creates a job in the steel industry to manufacture the steel to put in the car. And that's an indirect job. The person working there isn't on the assembly line at this auto plant, but he or she is working to make the steel that goes into it. So that's an indirect job. Now, on the 15th and the 31st, I'm working on that assembly line, I get a paycheck. And the reason I get a paycheck is because I helped make a car. But because I got a paycheck, now I can go and I can buy groceries and get a haircut and join the YMCA. Those are all induced jobs. So because that car was manufactured, I got a paycheck. Because I got a paycheck, I created part of a job for a barber because I could afford to pay him. So those are what indirect, and induced jobs mean. But for every full-time job that project creates, there's another half of job that's indirect and induced. That full-time direct job is $55,000 in labor income, and another 14,000 in labor income among those indirect and induced jobs. That 182,000 you spent on maintaining your courthouse, that generated $94,000 in local purchases. That means in that community, local purchases of goods and services. And in the end, that 182,000 spurs an additional 331,000 in economic activity, so that 182 ends up in $500,000 of economic activity. And then particularly important to you all, that $182,000 expenditure generates $1,728 in local taxes from the direct activities, and another $900 in indirect and induced activities, or a total of $6,700. Now, local government, that's county, that's also the school district and the town taxes. But the fact is that you're generating tax dollars returning to public coffers because of that public expenditure. And if you look at that, 182,000 expenditure gets me $6,700 in local tax revenues. That's about a 3.5% return on that investment. Forget what it did to the courthouse. Just on an economic standpoint, it gave you a return. I'll ask your county treasurer, I'll bet you don't have cash sitting around that's earning much more than 3.5%. So this makes a good investment. And then from the state, because sometimes you need to be asking the state to help you, the direct and indirect activity generated another $3,600 in taxes for the state government. So your courthouse is economically valuable, but because it is a holder of all of these non-economic values: historical value and political value and social value and cultural value and aesthetic value and educational value, associative value and environmental value and symbolic value. Those are real values, and those values also work to change, to enhance the economic value. But the trouble is, if that courthouse is not maintained, and if the courthouse is ultimately lost, those other values that were incorporated into that courthouse building, those other values, they're lost as well. There's no longer that symbolic value, that associative value, because the building's not there anymore. So you can't think of yourselves as, well, we're the owners of this building. In fact, you're the stewards of that courthouse. And that also burdens you with being the stewards of the values that that building represents. And generations who aren't even born yet will benefit from the care that you gave that courthouse today. So on behalf of my grandfather, who was born in the 19th century and died 50 years ago, and my grandchildren who were born in the 21st century, and who one day will visit where he worked in that Butte County Courthouse, we all thank you. So thanks very much.